our next speaker as we now shift topics to implementation science as well. And how do we, now having the context behind the problems, how do we understand how to implement solutions along with the barriers and study of how to implement through implementation science? Our next speaker is a senior research scientist at Kaiser Permanente, Southern California, Department of Research and Evaluation, and is an expert in implementation science. Please welcome Dr. Brian Mittman.
Thank you. So I too have the advantage of speaking relatively well into the course of the day with no need to talk at all about background or motivation or even about the nature of the solutions that we hope you will all develop over the course of the next couple of days, but instead to focus on the implementation challenge and to discuss in a way that in some ways provides a bit of the academic framing and background for some of the comments that Drs. Willis and Chakravarty both shared. So the motivation for the work that I do for the implementation science field, as well as for the implementation work that will, we hope, follow the solutions that you develop, is captured by this quote. Any of you who've seen any of the National Academy of Medicine reports are familiar with this, but it basically points out the idea that having innovative solutions is not enough. We need to apply them, the societal benefits of those innovations. And this is true of all forms of innovation and intervention development within the health-related fields and other fields as well. And that's really the issue that I'd like to focus on. And I'll say that much of the implementation work follows the completion of the innovations, their development and demonstrating their value. But we have to keep in mind the concept of designed for dissemination, which actually should be designed for implementation, but pointing out that during the development of those innovative solutions, looking down the road, thinking ahead to likely implementation challenges, and adjusting the design and the features of the solutions that you develop is the most appropriate time to begin to think about the implementation barriers, not only at the end when those solutions are ready for implementation. So the large boulder being pushed up the hill is in some ways the best way to think about the implementation challenge. We have a number of decades of research and implementation science that tells us many things about the challenges of implementing these solutions, especially when they are health-related. We know that for the most part, the behaviors of our health professionals, but also regulatory agencies and organizations and consumers have a high degree of inertia. They're relatively slow to change. There are the occasional exceptions of neat technological solutions that oftentimes are actually implemented too early before they've been proven to be effective. But for the most part, we're dealing with a highly conservative sector of our economy and society. We know that the problems and the solutions are highly heterogeneous. They tend to be very different across different communities and institutions, as well as vary across time. We know that the barriers that we need to overcome occur at multiple levels. And as a result of all of this complexity and heterogeneity, simple solutions are never adequate. Oftentimes they tend to be necessary but not sufficient, and education is perhaps the best example. We need to educate consumers, health professionals, organizations, but simply educating them about the value of a new solution does not even begin to overcome the many challenges and barriers to the appropriate adoption and use of that solution. So there are a number of reasons for this clinical inertia or this conservatism. I won't talk about them, but you've heard some of them. But basically, again, the idea is to think about multiple barriers, multiple challenges. And in some ways, the picture of the boulder doesn't really fully capture the nature of the problem. I think if you imagine a set of ropes and bars and chains that are holding that boulder in place, that's really what we're up against. And typically the solutions that we deploy are the equivalent of removing one or two of those ropes or bars and chains. And the boulder itself is not going to move until we release all of those factors. So this is one of the key academic frameworks that, again, captures some of the ideas and points that Drs. Willis and Chakravarty had made. Basically, the idea that we have multiple levels that we need to be concerned about. And again, as you think not only about the eventual implementation of solutions, but their design and their characteristics, thinking about the likelihood that each of these different groups of stakeholders and each of these different levels are likely to find those solutions acceptable, valuable, feasible is what we all need to keep in mind throughout the whole process of developing and implementing innovative solutions to societal problems. The very last bullet on this slide is important. 1950s medicine is what we often refer to as the idea that physicians were able to basically do what they wanted, and that the locus of efforts to change practices and to facilitate the adoption of innovative solutions could focus only on physicians. That's, of course, no longer the case. We now have a very broad spectrum of complicated regulations, fiscal barriers, organizational policies. Physicians within the Department of Veterans Affairs, Kaiser, have relatively little autonomy. They do, but relatively speaking, little autonomy over the kinds of care that they provide and the kinds of solutions that they're able to deliver. All of the organizational factors and others represent important influences. So again, thinking about the onion model as it's sometimes described, and thinking about the multiple levels of influence and constraints and factors is the key theme here. So as we try to both study implementation, but also in the policy and practice domain, overcome implementation barriers, the basic idea oftentimes is too little, too late. Basically, we, as I said earlier, essentially release one or two of the ropes and chains. We provide education, oftentimes we provide reminders, we address consumer barriers, but we tend not to recognize, or even if we do recognize, not to have the ability to overcome the multitudes of other barriers that are constraining the practices that we wish to implement, that are keeping us from eliminating the barriers to adoption of effective solutions. So the approach that I like to take in thinking about implementation, again, both for policy and practice audiences as well as researchers, is to think about a checklist of conditions. And when we have supportive conditions in these 8 different domains, implementation, adoption, delivery of innovative solutions is more likely. And I'll spend just a minute or so on each of these going through the list. We know, of course, to begin with, that solutions are not likely to be implemented and adopted if they're not effective, if they're not valuable. So having a good idea is the place that we start. But not all good ideas are created equal. And again, this is especially true in the health-related field. When we talk about implementing the results of large studies, the so-called healthy white male studies that show that a drug or a solution is effective for a limited subset of patients, or in our case, that a solution is effective in certain kinds of communities with high socioeconomic status and lots of supportive resources, those solutions are not necessarily feasible and certainly not necessarily valuable and effective in other kinds of settings. So thinking not only about the need for evidence, but about the right kind of evidence that has demonstrated to be valuable and relevant and applicable to a broad range of settings is one of our key challenges. Condition number 2, again, necessary but not sufficient. We know that we need clinicians, patients, regulatory officials, organizational leaders to understand what to do, to have the knowledge and skill is necessary, but by no means sufficient. In the health-related field, as well as in other professional fields, the literature, theories, ideas from the field called the sociology of the professions is critically important. Physicians often deal with a great deal of uncertainty, and there may be 4 or 5 alternative solutions, and oftentimes the solution that they prefer is not the one that has the greatest amount of evidence, but instead the one that has the greatest amount of professional acceptance. We talk about professional norms, norms within the professional community. So focusing on those norms and using peer influence strategies and others as a way of modifying and influencing professional norms in addition to knowledge, education, and skill is one of the key items on this list of necessary but not sufficient conditions. Physicians, other health professionals, all of us go to work each day with a number of different goals and a number of different opportunities for us to do better. And I suppose we can think about the saying, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. Within systems like VA, Kaiser, and many others, it's the practices that are measured and monitored and for which senior leadership and external stakeholders and others place a great deal of importance, where they tend to focus their attention. Those are the practices that tend to get the attention and the attention allocation on the part of the professionals. So we need to make sure that senior leaders and external stakeholders who are considered to be important and influential are pulling in our direction, that they expect to see improvements in pain-related practices. They expect to see implementation of these solutions, and these problems are a priority relative to all of the other opportunities that professionals have to improve care. Consumer acceptance is critically important. It's not enough in the case of medical care and health care for physicians to know what to do. Oftentimes we like to say that no amount of beating the physicians over the head with education and financial incentives and reminders to prescribe the right medicines or to encourage their patients to adopt healthy behaviors, none of that is likely to be enough if the patients themselves are resistant. So focusing on consumers and what we need to do in order to influence consumers and encourage them to be accepting of innovative solutions is part of the struggle, and again, another important item on our list. We often find with physicians in particular that presenting them with a set of recommendations, with a set of innovative solutions, with a set of protocols and guidelines for practicing in order to achieve good outcomes is often viewed as enough. And we often see physicians nodding and saying, yes, I'm aware of those recommendations, I prescribe that medication, I use that solution, until we show those physicians that they're actually not prescribing that medication as appropriate, that the small number of exceptions that they think exist, where my patients are different, or for most patients this is appropriate, but it's not appropriate for mine, we need to provide actual data. And there's a number of, we have a number of solutions and specific methods that we often label audit and feedback and performance monitoring and feedback that allow us to provide the health professionals, the agencies, with the hard data to show them that they are practicing in a way that represents not optimal quality, that there are significant quality gaps or implementation gaps. So again, another item on the list of conditions. Condition number 7, again, is especially important in the healthcare field and others where we have very complicated delivery systems, where it's not just a matter of telling physicians to prescribe A instead of B, but instead changing the entire spectrum of influences. We need to know what it is that is posing and representing the key barrier, or the key barriers more often than not. We need to understand something about why, in the case of some work we're doing at Kaiser, only half of our patients in many parts of Southern California are receiving HPV vaccinations, our 11 and 13-year-olds. Oftentimes it's because the physicians are not being active enough in prescribing, or the nurses make comments about how the vaccine is maybe not so necessary, and other minor comments that actually have significant influence. In other cases, the physicians and nurses are very proactive in promoting vaccination. It's the patients and their parents and their friends and family and other community members who represent the resistance. So the point here is that gaps in the implementation and adoption of effective, innovative practices are not all created equal, that different gaps have different causes. And until we can diagnose the root causes of those gaps, we can't begin to develop and eventually deploy effective solutions. And then finally, logistical arrangements. Again, oftentimes physicians, health system leaders, patients, nurses, others know what to do. They would like to do the right thing. They just don't have the time or the space or the financial reimbursement. So developing innovative solutions to allow for the efficient, feasible, effective delivery of innovative solutions is, again, one of the key items on the list. So let me begin, let me end rather with just one simple slide that in some ways tries to capture this checklist. which again is applicable to the post-solution implementation efforts, but something that ideally you would each keep in mind as you're developing the solution. We know we need to have demonstrated value, and that value of the innovative solutions has to be viewed as relevant and acceptable to the target audiences. We know that we need to understand why that innovative solution is not being delivered, or what the likely barriers are to its delivery. The staff training, the clinician training, the patient training, education, those are all necessary. The monitoring, the pressure from external stakeholders is critically important. Patients are an important part of this in any health-related area. In the logistical issues. And again, as you've heard earlier in the day from multiple speakers, we need not just simple solutions that we will educate clinicians and patients. We need the equivalent of multi-level, multi-stakeholder campaigns that will address all of the barriers, that will bring together all of the stakeholder groups, and eventually hope that we can implement the solutions that we hope to see from your work. So thank you.